Happy Thursday, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Horrifically Charming, where we embrace the dark, live the horror, and dissect it all. I'm your host, Joe Thomas, and on this week's episode, we're going to be talking about sex and horror. All right, let's dive right in. First things first. So, sex and horror, they are kind of synonymous. You can go back as early as 1913 to the fall of Troy. Now it's a French film or something like that. So I'm translating. But you've got Helen of Troy, who is so beautiful that she brings on the, downfall of an entire empire. But you really start to see that sexualization of horror when you get into things like, for me, as early as like 1931 with Dracula, where you've got the biting of the neck, the exchanging of bodily fluids. It is all very sexual. And surprisingly so. But I think that kind of thing still continues into current day horror movies, especially when it comes to the vampire genre of or subgenre of horror movies, because even more now than back then, the biting of the neck is a very sexualized. When you see people gasping and moaning with pleasure when it's happening a lot of the time. So it's very romanticized and sexualized even that far back. But for sex in horror and what it kind of symbolizes. So you go to the things of, of course, we all know the sex equals death trope, but how did that trope get started? Where did sex become so blatantly and where you couldn't pull sex and horror apart? You couldn't separate the two because it just wouldn't work. Sex kind of symbolizes the loss of innocence. For us in horror, we needed to have like that clear boundary of these people could die, these people couldn't. And that moral line. So sex, and sometimes drugs, but I definitely feel more sex. Sex was always that line that we knew by the 80s. If someone was having sex, they were going to die. That was just, it was a sealed deal. So in a way, it kind of ruined parts of horror movies because we knew when we saw that tramp Betty sleeping with John that she was going to die. John probably was too, but he was probably going to die off camera somewhere, and we just had to kind of figure out that he died. So you've got things like that where puberty and bloodlust seem to go together, especially with young girls. Women in horror, girls in horror tend to have much more on-screen time and much more speaking time, but most of the time it's blatantly sexualized. So the girls are getting punished. When a female dies in a horror movie, especially if she has been a naughty girl, she is going to die a more prolonged, and her death is going to be drug out more. Whereas men usually die pretty quickly, or even, like I said, off screen, and we just kind of have to figure out that they died. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. You've got the things of horror and sex are both in their own way considered taboo. But we also have always relied on horror to kind of bring those taboo things into light. So the two are definitely always going to be connected in some way. You've got the kind of I don't want to call it a trope necessarily, but I guess you could, where teenagers, when they have sex or do drugs, they're kind of they're inviting the monster in. So when we're watching them on screen and we see Susie and John having sex, it does, whether we want to admit it or not, it tells us it's okay for them to die. So we kind of equate that sex and drugs with the immorality that is, like it's their fault. They're inviting the devil in when they do those things, which in our minds makes it okay for them to die. So the symbolism of sex for me in horror is very much, how to put this? Sex in horror for me symbolizes the morality. So, and I understand that in now movies, more modern movies, that is not the case, but I'm talking about the movies I grew up with. So the movies I grew up with, if you had sex, you died. So I equated that to good people and bad people. The good people didn't have sex, the bad people did. So for me, sex very clearly symbolized morality. If you share a different view, please leave it in the comments. Okay, so next subject we're going to tackle is kind of the rise of sex in horror movies. As I said, we can go back as far as 1913, probably even further back, and find sex in horror. I mean, if you go back to like Gothic artwork, which is, even back into Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, you can find the sexuality in that. But with horror movies, it was kind of right out of the gate, alluded to, but not blatant. For me, a lot of people say that it didn't become blatant until the 80s. I can agree with that in some aspects, but there are other aspects that I don't agree with that, because again, for me, the very act of biting a woman's neck was very sexual to me. And I understand it wasn't blatant sex, but it was, I mean, you could, well, it's okay, I shouldn't be watching this. So it's always been there. Now, when we talk about this, you can do like the 60s and the 70s. Sex was there, but it was more alluding to sex and the eroticism. We weren't to the point where we had that sex equals death thing. So 60s and 70s, you would see sex, but it didn't mean someone was necessarily going to die in a movie. Now that became full blown and completely obvious in the 80s. I mean, late 70s, but definitely by the 80s, that trope of sex equals death was well established. You have the emergence of Michael Myers. Michael Myers and Jason both are, so as much as Jason and Michael are supposed to be mindless killers, they're no rhyme, no reason, just they don't talk, they're just going to kill you, right? But if you watch those movies with the perspective of sex, there sex is giving Jason and Michael that moral code. Like, yes, they go after the final girl, which again, final girl was created in Halloween, the original Halloween. Laurie Strode is the original final girl. But they kill everyone else before they go after. And there is even that kind of, do they want to kill them? Like, I know they go after them, but there's always that part of me that goes, I don't know. Do they actually want to kill them? Or is it that they just are out of their mind in a frenzy at this point? So whatever. But definitely we see it evolving 60s, 70s. In the 80s, it's full blown. You have the rise of the morality majority. So in the 80s, we had the just say no to drugs and, a lot of censorship on media and music. So, and of course, especially sex. So horror took those things that were not easily accessible to teens and young adults and put them in the movie. Now, that's kind of what society as a whole, or what horror does. Horror very much evolves with society. What is current in society? What are society's current fears? And that's what they're going to bring into horror, because horror plays off of our fears. So in order to keep scaring us, they have to chase what we're afraid of. So for a lot of people, even though the teenagers and young adults were chasing after, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, there was still like the part of us that knew this was a no-no. We had all of society telling it was a no-no. Our church was telling us this. Our parents were telling us this. Our teachers, everyone, our neighbors, everyone was telling us sex is bad. If you have sex, you are a sinner. So sex equals sin. Sin is loss of innocence. Sin means that loss of innocence, and you are now a target for all the bad things in the world. So I definitely think that's where they came into play so heavily in the 80s, was because that was what society as a whole was fearing on. So there was that just blatant sex and that huge rise in sex and horror becoming so intertwined that you just could not pull the two apart back in the 80s. It just horror kind of wouldn't have made sense at that point. It's kind of funny because Halloween is credited with creating that trope, creating the sex equals death trope. But Carpenter himself in an interview said, no, that was not my intention at all. I didn't want that trope. It's not how I viewed the movie. He said that that trope was created by society projecting their own religious guilt onto the film. And so we took that away from the film because of our own religious guilt, that was never intended, and that's not how he sees the movie at all. So I always found that kind of interesting, that he so vehemently doesn't want to take credit for that, which, by the way, Mr. Carpenter, you should, because it's always going to be associated with Halloween. So there we've got the rise. And although we are seeing it dying off now, and that's where we're going to get into our next topic, which is going to be horror and sex. Where do they go from here? So in recent years, there seems to be where they're going the complete opposite way with sex and horror. So horror is not so intricately interlaced with sex. The perfect example I can come up with of this is Hellraiser. So I am a huge Hellraiser fan. I love Doug Bradley. I love Simon Bamford over there. The original Cenobites. Now, I watched this movie at a very young age. Much, much younger than I should have, probably, but that's a story for another time, of how horror has gotten me through some very traumatic events in my life, even when I was too little to be watching it. Let's be honest. But in fact, when I met Doug Bradley at Days of the Dead this year, I told him the age at which I was watching his movies and how they helped me deal with this trauma. And I don't know if he was too happy to hear that, but he did say he was happy that he helped me get through some trauma. So, hey, there's that. But in the original Hellraiser, this is probably one of the top sexually infused movies that I can think of. That probably didn't intentionally mean to, but you've got the Cenobites themselves who, hello, BDSM, like those costumes, the gag ball, hello, that is complete. If that doesn't scream sex to you, then you probably should have your eyes checked. But then you've got the things like the lines, come to daddy. Okay. My favorite line, and one of my absolute favorite lines of all times from any horror movie. Okay. We have such sights to show you. Like, I get chills every time I think of that line, every time I hear that man's voice saying it. Ugh, it's just, even at a young age, I knew that meant something naughty. Like, he was not talking about wanting to take me and show me the sights at the Grand Canyon. Okay. The relation between that statement and sex, it's just one of those things that when you hear it, you know that they don't want to torture you. The Cenobites, the famous saying, angel to some, demon to others. Okay. They weren't good or evil. They were completely neutral. Nothing they did was with malice. but there was also no reasoning with them. And their whole point was pleasure, taking you past that point of pain to where your pain is so intense that it's now pleasurable. So you hear pleasure and all of these things so often in Hellraiser. And so for me, again, probably one of the most sexually charged movies of all time. But then you go to the remake in 2022 and it's just completely devoid of it. For me to watch a remake done where they intentionally take parts like that out, where I do feel like it was intentionally removed from the movie for, current day society, but it ruined it. First off, Pinhead as a woman, I wasn't a fan of that. Now, mind you, the acting in it was great. Cinematography, fantastic. Directing, awesome. It wasn't that it was a bad movie. It was that you took something that was perfect and remade it, not in even its own image, but they took the thing that made it perfect, that alluding to sexuality, and then sometimes, yes, blatant, but it was more of just, you knew the naughtiness that was in the background the whole time throughout this movie, and you just took it away. So now you just have Cenobites who are doing things to do things because they want to hurt people, it felt like. And that's not what the original was about. You've got the the David Gordon Green, trilogy for Halloween. Same thing, almost completely devoid of sex. And especially for me, because Halloween, one of my top 3 favorite horror movies. So to have the original movie that literally created the trope, sorry, Mr. Carpenter, of sex equals death, and then remake it and not have that in it. No. And I try. I watch all of the Halloweens, okay? I don't care what anybody says. I don't let anybody's judgment get in my way. I say my own piece, and I will watch any movie I want, no matter how bad the reviews, and I will give my honest opinion on it. This movie wasn't horrible. These movies weren't horrible. But for me, it wasn't true to Halloween itself. So we've got these things where, first off, side note, topic for another day, please stop remaking movies. If you want to take sex out of horror, then go make a new movie. Stop taking our classics and remaking them and taking stuff out of them. Like, just stop it. Leave shit alone. Stop remaking it. And I'm not just talking about horror here. Stop remaking movies. Anyways, so we've got this trend started where they're removing sex from horror. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, okay? For me, I'm always going to want some sex in my horror because, again, the two are intertwined for me. That's how my brain was created in the 80s, okay? The two are just inextricably intertwined, okay? But I don't mind movies that don't have it either because there are plenty of them that have scared me that don't have them. But where do we see it going? So I definitely see there being less. And I think part of the reason for that, because they have to find a way to shock us. So, Final Girl doesn't live anymore. The dogs aren't safe. The kids aren't safe. They have to keep finding ways to shock us. And at this point, we're almost unshockable. So they're going to keep breaking these tropes to try to surprise us. And the other thing is, because sex now is so easily available. I mean, my gosh, how many porn websites are there? Who buys magazines anymore? You can get porn for free online. OnlyFans. I mean, it's just, we're flooded with it. So it does not play a part in the movies anymore in shocking us. Therefore, it's not needed in horror anymore for the shock value. So I definitely think we're going to be seeing a decline for that reason. I'm wondering what the next rise in horror is going to be. So if you have an idea, leave a comment down below. Tell me what you think the next trend in horror is going to be, because for right now, I think we're going to see a lot less sex going on, guys, much to my dismay, because I personally am a fan. So that's going to be it for this week, guys. Thank you so much for joining in on the second episode of Horrifically Charming. I am so excited to be doing this. It is just something that just brings me great joy, and I hope that you guys feel that. This is only possible because of the support from you guys, my friends, my family, and now my fans. I have fans. I have like 2, and that's a big deal to me. So I definitely want to thank everyone. Please make sure that you like, follow, subscribe, all that stuff on social media. We have Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram for social media right now. I'm working on some others. You can view the podcast, the video, on Spotify and on YouTube. You can listen on iHeart, Apple, and Amazon Music. And that's going to be it for this week, guys. Next week, we're going to be talking about magic in horror films. So that's one that I personally am a big fan of. So we're going to be even more excited next week. But until next week, guys, may every day be filled with horror and sprinkled with charm. See you next week, guys.